And at times you ask yourself, like, am I crazy? Am I crazy? Am I the one who's nuts and seeing this conspiracy that really isn't there?
Every so often, someone will ask me what software I use to get the clips I put in my videos. Most of the time, especially with shorter clips, I use a screen recorder program called ScreenFlow. It works pretty well, but it does have its flaws. For example, if you're going to use it, it's best that you record the original video, because if you make a copy of a copy, the image will get more and more distorted. Let me show you an example of this. This is the original footage from the first video I appeared on camera. This is what happens when you use the screen recorder. This is what happens if you record that recording. And then if you record that recording, and on it goes. As you may have guessed, this video is not about ScreenFlow though. That's just a ham-fisted analogy for what happens with information online. News spreads like a game of telephone. You have what actually happened, then you get first-hand accounts of that. Then, because so much news is derivative these days, you get accounts of these accounts. And that's the level at which most people consume their news. And then they tell their friends what they hear, and on it goes. At every level, things get more and more distorted. Back in March, I started a series about how Bernie Sanders wasn't robbed of the Democratic nomination in either 2016 or 2020. My friend Sean over at the channel Actual Justice Warrior was kind enough to allow me to post that first video on his channel. The link to Sean's channel is in the description box below, just in case you're not already watching him. I deliberately had him post that video on March 2nd, as that was the 1-year anniversary of Bloody Monday. The day before Super Tuesday, when Amy Klobuchar and Mayor Pete dropped out of the presidential campaign, and along with Beto O'Rourke, endorsed Joe Biden, supposedly at Barack Obama's instruction. The funny thing is, the day that video came out, the first 2020 campaign biography was also released. Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency, by Amy Parnes and Jonathan Allen. I love campaign biography books, and since I'm doing this series, I read the entire thing right away. I wasn't alone in this. Krista Ball over at Rising read it, as did Branko Marcetic over at Jacobin. Other online leftists who didn't read the book took these accounts and gave their own analysis of it. After reading the book myself, and hearing what other people thought of it, I weirdly have a much greater appreciation for Scott Adams of all people. I always thought that his metaphor for confirmation bias, that we're all in the same theater, looking at the same screen, but we're effectively watching different movies, was overstated. Now, honestly, I think that's pretty much spot on, because I swear these people read a different book than I did. I've talked about Bloody Monday twice in videos and a million times on Twitter, and honestly I didn't want to go over it again. But when I saw online leftists so thoroughly misrepresent the contents of this book, I felt compelled to do so. Don't worry, there's more to this video than that, but I do feel the need to rehash those events in light of this new book. I'll provide plenty of quotations from the book showing that these people have completely misrepresented the book's contents and overall narrative. But just in case you don't want to take my word for it, the link to its Amazon page is in the description box below. Also, if you're someone who just listens to my videos rather than watches, you should know that sometimes in this video I'll reference the book without reading the text. The page number and original quotations are there visually, just in case you want to check it out. I do recommend reading the book, even if you don't really care about Bernie Sanders. It's intriguing and very well written. If you're into politics like I am, you'll probably enjoy it. Either way, I suspect you'll see that the internet distorts information a lot faster than my screen recording program does. Before I get into the book, though, I want to briefly talk about conspiracy and its relationship with democracy. The most remarkable thing about Bloody Monday is that what happened on that day doesn't really need an explanation beyond what everyone saw. Candidates drop out of races and make endorsements all the time. There's nothing remotely peculiar or illegitimate about any of it. There was a grand total of 29 candidates in the 2020 Democratic primary, 22 of whom dropped out prior to Bloody Monday. Nobody thought there was anything weird or corrupt going on when John Delaney, Michael Bennet, or Tim Ryan dropped out. We all understood that they suspended their campaigns because they knew they weren't going to win. If anything, there was mockery from the online left that they even tried to run in the first place. Running for public office takes a lot of time, energy, and money, and most people undergo complete humiliation rather than experiencing anything approaching victory. Most people don't stick around longer than they're viable. Yet when two more candidates dropped out, Amy Klobuchar, the uncharismatic senator from a mid-sized Midwestern state, and Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of an inconsequential city in Indiana, all of a sudden the online left is calling treachery. I submit to you that if you looked at the state of the race post-South Carolina, but you removed the names of the candidates and just showed where everyone stood in terms of delegates, percentage of the vote, the demographics of the vote, cash on hand, and all other relevant metrics, no one in their right mind would question why Klobuchar or Buttigieg dropped out when they did. If anything, you'd wonder why these candidates didn't leave the race sooner. The only reason why anyone has invoked conspiracy is because Bernie Sanders lost. I should also note that treachery and conspiracy only really became operative explanations retrospectively, after it was clear that their withdrawal helped Joe Biden. When these two candidates dropped out and endorsed Biden, there was absolutely no guarantee that it was going to benefit the former vice president in a major way. Voters, especially in primaries, don't split neatly along ideological lines. Throughout the campaign, the second choice of most Biden voters was actually Bernie Sanders, and the second choice of most Sanders voters was Joe Biden. In my first video, I pointed out that progressives kept saying this when the field was still packed, and they were right. It just so happened that things worked out this way this time around, for reasons that progressives might not want to hear that I'll discuss later, but this wasn't preordained by any means. Here was our buddy Kyle right before the South Carolina primary, just before in-person Super Tuesday voting started.
So this is an attempt to get that moderate establishment vote, corral it, to take down Bernie Sanders at the last minute. Is it possible it's going to work? I don't know, because there was a lot of early voting that already happened in California. It already happened in Texas. Bernie Sanders is up massively as a result of that. It looks like he's going to win California and Texas. There is an open question as to how this impacts the rest of the states. In a weird way, Amy dropping out will probably help Bernie in Minnesota, because he's number 2. Like, he was tied with Amy and Biden was off in Nowheresville. So is this enough to get him over the top in Minnesota? Doubt it. It'll probably go to Bernie. But in other states, will it potentially help Biden? Yes, because in other states, it could make him get over that 15% threshold so that he gets delegates in more states than he would have gotten previously. So with this move, I don't know. I think it does make it more likely that Bernie doesn't get an outright majority. But it doesn't necessarily make it so that he won't have a plurality. I still think it's overwhelmingly likely he'll get a plurality. And I don't know. And it's also happening at the last minute, so it might be too late on that front anyway.
Here was Kyle after the primary was over, when it was clear that Biden had benefited from the winnowing field.
And just so you understand, guys, listen, without that coup that happened right before Super Tuesday, it was like a coup. What happened? Somehow, in a political masterstroke at the last minute, you had Obama make the phone call to Mayor Pete and Amy Klobuchar, and they dropped out and endorsed Biden. Which, without that, Biden would not have won. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Without that move, Biden would not have won. Bernie would have won. He would have gotten at least a plurality.
In my first video, I pinpointed the moment this rumor started. It was by Emma Vigeland on TYT's Super Tuesday election night coverage, well after it was clear that Joe Biden was the big winner that night. Now, I don't mean to pick on Sanders supporters. Conspiracies about elections and the candidates who win them are incredibly prevalent in our politics. One of the reasons why is fairly obvious. People don't want to believe that their side lost fair and square. Birtherism, Russiagate, Stop the Steal, and the rigged Democratic primaries are mostly just stories that people tell one another in an effort to convince themselves that the winner of an election they don't like is somehow illegitimate, or that their guy didn't actually lose. The motivated reasoning there is obvious, and unfortunately, I think we're well past the point where people will accept the results of elections that they don't approve of. I believe there's another, less obvious reason why electoral conspiracies are so prevalent, though. Our country values democracy, frankly, a lot more than we should, in my opinion. Yet, we see that our politics are incredibly dysfunctional. I think people would rather believe that this is all going according to someone's plan, rather than acknowledging that this is the best we can do. People would rather live according to a plan, even an evil plan, than live under chaos. When people ask me if the DNC rigged the primaries against Bernie Sanders, my answer is that it doesn't matter. By that, I mean, I don't think anything the DNC did or allegedly did would have changed the results in 2016 or 2020. It also doesn't matter in that most Sanders supporters were never going to accept the legitimacy of the results as long as Bernie lost. Even if we take Bloody Monday at face value, people still voted the way they did of their own volition. There are very few accusations, no credible ones anyways, that votes were changed or that the results were skewed in some way. Again, there's nothing illegitimate about candidates dropping out and making endorsements. Even the great Barack Obama cannot make people vote a certain way. Here's how I've seen some Sanders supporters react when you put it to them this way.
If Bernie Sanders had like 3 or 4 more % of the vote, then he would have won a lot of
If
states.
my dick was about
been like
3
Obama.
inches longer, I could be a star.
Well, wait, but you said it's impossible for him to win.
Yes,
it wasn't.
because
if he
because
had,
the
wait, if he
DNC
had more
controls
voters,
the
he would've-
pipeline. TJ,
They control.
TJ.
They cannot control the fucking individual will of individual voters, though.
Yes, they can.
Well, then what's the point? Then
Have you
there's
never
no
heard
point.
of manufactured
Wait, if you
consent?
really, yeah, I have, Paul. But if you
Then
really
what
believe
are
that
you
there's
talking
no
about
point,
then?
well, then why are we even having this argument? Because you're basically saying people are just brainwashed automatons that cannot be changed. So why are we even arguing about this?
There's always going to be something. If it's not Hillary getting debate questions, or the debacle of the Iowa caucuses, then it's media bias and manufacturing consent. Blaming the media is the last refuge of a sore loser. You could have the most open, transparent, and democratic process possible, and this would still be the reaction of many people in the losing camp. In the case of the Sandernistas, their definition of democracy is them winning. I should also say, as is the case with all of my videos, the point of this series is not to persuade people. If I do, that's great, but I have no expectation of doing so. If somebody wants to believe something, they're unlikely to relinquish that belief in the face of evidence. As I'll argue, Lucky throws cold water on the Bloody Monday narrative. In the face of this, a lot of Sanders supporters will probably just dismiss the book as propaganda. All that said, even if conspiracies are entirely motivated in reasoning, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. We still have to deal with the facts on the ground as they are. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the book Lucky and see what it says about the 2020 Democratic primary. A week after the book came out, Crystal Ball did one of her radar segments on it, where she makes a litany of claims.
This pattern of events and orientation of the Democratic Party is also made blatantly clear in the new campaign memoir, Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. Now, the central narrative of that book is exactly as the subhead suggests, but a secondary theme is also just the lengths that every single establishment player was willing to go to in order to make sure that Sanders did not succeed. They could have really called the entire first half of the book the plot to stop Bernie. There was Bill Clinton telling DNC Chair Tom Perez that the one thing that mattered over the next few years was, quote, this is not going to be the party of Bernie. There was Hillary Clinton nearly jumping into the race as she watched Bernie's numbers climb in the wake of his heart attack and AOC's endorsement. There was Michael Bloomberg actually jumping into the race to thwart Bernie as he saw Biden flailing. There's Pete collaborating with CNN to spike the absolutely critical Iowa Seltzer poll, denying Bernie 2 days of momentum-building coverage leading into the Iowa caucuses. They even have establishment Democrats actually admitting that they may prefer to lose to Trump than have Bernie in the White House. Just take that in. The same people who described Trump as literal Hitler were okay with him winning again if it meant preventing the horrors of, oh my God, everyone would have health care. And of course, there's Obama behind the scenes, shaping everything. There's an incredible scene early on when he makes the case for his one-time adversary, Elizabeth Warren, to corporate elites because he thinks she is better poised to beat Bernie than Biden was at that time. And of course, in those crucial post-South Carolina days, he was back there working the phones to get Amy and Pete to drop to clear the path for Joe once he realized there was literally no other anti-Bernie choice. And at times you ask yourself, like, am I crazy? Am I crazy? Am I the one who's nuts and seeing this conspiracy that really isn't there? But when you read the details, we're actually being too measured in our coverage.
I wouldn't call Crystal crazy, but she is absolutely seeing a conspiracy where there is none. So too with Bronco Mercedic at Jacobin. The title of his review was The Democratic Party's Real War in 2020 Was Against Bernie Sanders. Crystal, Bronco, and the other progressives I've heard talk about this book have a very bad habit of placing Bernie where he doesn't belong and overstating his importance in events. There are grains of truth in what she said, though. Most establishment Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Barack Obama, and countless nameless party insiders, didn't want Bernie Sanders to be their nominee. It is true that Bill Clinton told Tom Perez, the head of the DNC, that he did not want the Democratic Party to become the party of Bernie Sanders. We'll revisit this later. But for now, let's unpack the specific claims Crystal made and see how they stack up against what the book actually said. Lucky is more or less bifurcated between the primary and the general election. And while Bernie is prominently featured in the first half, the much more prevalent theme, I would argue, is how many Democratic Party insiders were not very enthusiastic about Biden's frontrunner status because they viewed him as a weak candidate, even though Biden consistently led in the polls. The vast majority of establishment Democrats thought what a lot of people online thought. Joe Biden was an over-the-hill gaffe machine that couldn't go toe-to-toe with Trump. Barack Obama didn't want Bernie to be the nominee. He also thought Joe Biden would make a poor candidate, and he didn't want his former VP embarrassing himself or tarnishing the legacy of either of them.
Obama's fears about Biden and his team ran deep, deeper than defeat. Obama worried that his former vice president would embarrass himself from the campaign trail and that the people around him would not be able to prevent a belly flop. The former president invited Biden aides to his office in Washington's West End in March so that he could get a briefing on the imminent campaign. He wasn't so much interested in strategy, tactics, or which person would be placed in which job. He didn't care how Biden would answer a question about the crime bill or climate change. He wanted reassurance that Biden's legacy would be protected, that his staff would not let him become a tragicomic caricature of an aging politician having his last hurrah. This concern was mostly about looking out for his friend, but Obama's name was also inextricably tied to Biden's. Obama wanted to make sure that Joe's long-term reputation wasn't going to be endangered, said one person who participated in the meeting. He certainly wasn't confident Joe was going to win. No one was. But win or lose, Obama looked at the coming primary as the Wild West of politics, a lawless and unpredictable melee that could leave Biden not just beaten, but permanently scarred.
Hillary Clinton also contemplated entering the race, yes, because she didn't want Bernie to be the nominee, but also because she didn't see a winner in the massive field and saw Joe Biden faltering. Despite the fact that he had endorsed Joe Biden, John Kerry thought the exact same thing when he was campaigning with the former vice president in Iowa. The intentions of Kerry and Clinton are ultimately moot, though. Neither of them actually went through with jumping into the race. Mike Bloomberg, however, decided to pull the trigger in November of 2019. Like Clinton and Kerry, Bloomberg did not want Bernie being the nominee, but also saw Biden struggling. Bloomberg ultimately went a step further, though, in that he decided that the cornerstone of his strategy would be to make life even more difficult for the former vice president. Believing that the two would occupy the same ideological lane, Bloomberg, with the help of his billion-dollar war chest, actively sought to absorb Biden's support. He started to poach Biden's staffers with more generous pay and benefits.
In January, he began working hard to cannibalize Biden's support. Late that month, he met with the House's new Democrat coalition, a group of lawmakers with strong ties to the financial services industry, and leaders of the centrist Blue Dog Coalition. Bloomberg dialed up Democratic officials in big cities and sent top aides to meetings like one in Detroit, in which his advisors met with leaders of the black community to try to assuage concerns about his record on stop-and-frisk policing in New York. Bloomberg recognized the error of his ways, the aides told an audience of black entertainment, business, and political luminaries at actor Hill Harper's house. Members of his team showed up in state capitals and at fundraising events for state legislators. The effect of all this activity was to remind elected officials, donors, and other high-profile validators that Bloomberg loomed over Biden's shoulder.
He even sought out Biden donors, not because he needed them, but because he wanted to starve Biden's cash-strapped operation. While a lot of people didn't want Bernie to be the nominee, it was actually Joe Biden who had one of the richest men alive actively trying to sabotage his effort. And it worked to the point where the former vice president had to completely defund his Super Tuesday operation to get through Nevada and South Carolina. Bloomberg ultimately faltered in the debates, which cost him any real shot at the nomination. However, he was still in the race on Super Tuesday, and all of the votes he got that day appeared to come out of Biden's pocket. Despite the split field with the moderate candidates, and the most well-financed candidate actively seeking to sabotage the former VP, Joe Biden absolutely destroyed Bernie on Super Tuesday. What about CNN spiking the Des Moines Register Iowa Seltzer poll?
There's Pete collaborating with CNN to spike the absolutely critical Iowa Seltzer poll, denying Bernie 2 days of momentum-building coverage leading into the Iowa caucuses.
Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this because the 2020 Iowa caucuses will get its own video in this series by itself. But once again, we see Crystal inserting a conspiracy against Bernie where there is none. The poll had Bernie in the lead, Warren in second, and Mayor Pete in third. Biden was in a distant fourth. It was Liz Smith, the campaign manager for Mayor Pete, that called CNN and told them not to air the poll. The fig leaf of a rationale she presented was that one poll in one of the call centers left Mayor Pete off the list of candidates. There was no evidence that this error went past that single instance. But still, in an effort to maintain what little credibility they had left, CNN folded to Smith and chose not to air their poll. This did rob Bernie of momentum he likely would have gotten in the final stretch before the caucuses. But this wasn't some conspiracy against him. It was an effort by Pete's campaign to boost their candidate. They desperately needed to win those first 2 states to gain momentum before they headed into states with larger minority populations, demographics that Pete was not doing well with. The fact that it hurt Bernie is entirely incidental. It likely hurt Warren as well, since she was in a close second. What about that meeting that Crystal is referencing here?
Obama behind the scenes. I mean, that is an incredible scene when he goes and talks to these black corporate executives. Yes. Touting Elizabeth Warren, who he had so much bad blood with. He hated, actually. Simply because he saw Biden was floundering and he thought this may be our only shot to defeat Bernie.
This was a meeting between Barack Obama and the donors to his foundation. The donors were black corporate power brokers and CEOs like Ken Chenault of Amex, Kenneth Frazier of Merck, and Ray McGuire of Citigroup. Trust me, these details are important. Bernie is not mentioned much in Lucky's account of this meeting. In fact, it took place 2 days after Bernie's heart attack. At the time, it seemed possible he'd be out of the race purely based on that. Furthermore, this wasn't Obama hesitantly going to Warren because he wanted to stop Bernie. He was enthusiastically trying to sell Warren to a group of black men from corporate America and Wall Street that Warren would make a good president, and should she get the nomination, they should support her effort. He did this because Warren was on the rise at the time. A week earlier, she had briefly eclipsed Joe Biden as frontrunner in the RCP average. She was leading in Iowa at the time as well. Her campaign was gaining serious momentum and media attention. Parnes and Allen described it as a juggernaut. It looked like there were 4 candidates at the time who had a real shot of the nomination: Mayor Pete, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. Obama didn't want Sanders, nor did he want Biden. In fact, the name of the chapter this meeting was mentioned in is "You Forgot Biden."
But when he wrapped up, he had left someone out. "You forgot Biden," one executive said, reminding him of his 2-term vice president. Obama seemed apprehensive, according to a source in the room. His support for Biden was tepid at best, the person said. At that point, it didn't matter what he said about Biden. His silence spoke for him.
Obama liked Pete, but he saw the former South Bend mayor as too young, too short, executive of a city too small, and yes, too gay to be elected president. So Obama tried to sell Warren to 2 constituencies that would likely be skeptical of her: black men and Wall Street types.
Obama paused again, before making his final appeal, squarely addressing the elephant in the room, in a tone that was half ribbing and half reprimanding. "So what if she raises your taxes a little bit? Compare that to what we have now." This was definitely not a time to sit on the sidelines, Obama said with some urgency. If Warren won the nomination, he said he would support her and stressed that he wanted Wall Street and corporate types to do the same. "Everyone in this room needs to pull their weight," he said. "Republicans," he continued, "are winning cycle after cycle up and down the ballot because their donors care more than the Democrats' donors. Hillary's loss could be attributed in part to insufficient support among black men in major cities, and she had never had the support of elite black men that she had among black women. Things would have to be different for Warren. She would need the votes of black men on the ground and the money of black men in boardrooms, especially because she had forsworn buckraking with wealthy donors."
And now we come back to Bloody Monday. Crystal repeats the narrative that I dealt with in the previous video in this series.
And of course, in those crucial post-South Carolina days, he was back there working the phones to get Amy and Pete to drop to clear the path for Joe once he realized there was literally no other anti-Bernie choice.
So let's take a look at what Lucky reports and see if it changes anything. Something people seem to have forgotten is that the South Carolina primary and Super Tuesday were only 3 days apart. And it was the day after his dismal performance in South Carolina that Mayor Pete decided he was done.
When Pete Buttigieg woke up early Sunday, March 1st, 2020, at the Hampton Inn in Americus, Georgia, he had made up his mind. This is going to be the last day, he thought, as he got out of bed. Before he'd shut his eyes Saturday night, Buttigieg had heard a unanimous recommendation from his people that it was time to pull the plug. His delegate projections for Super Tuesday, based on the results in the first 4 contests, looked bleak. He would need freakishly great outcomes in the coming states to have any path to the nomination, even through a party-splitting convention brawl.
After a third-place finish in the Nevada caucuses, and an even more disappointing fourth-place finish in South Carolina, where he didn't manage to win any delegates, and it was clear that he couldn't excite any non-white voters, something that is essential for winning the Democratic nomination and the general election after that, it was clear that Mayor Pete was not going to be the Democratic nominee. While Mayor Pete had seen the writing on the wall, and had already made his decision, there was a former Democratic president who gave him the last little nudge. Not this guy. Nope, not this guy either. No, it was Jimmy Carter of all people. The two had met for breakfast prior to attending a ceremony commemorating the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the day that peaceful civil rights protesters were attacked by police officers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. This event should not be confused with Bloody Monday, as blood was actually spilled on Bloody Sunday, and the people protesting there had actual grievances. They had actual things to complain about. They weren't all bent out of shape about unsubstantiated internet rumors. After Mayor Pete dropped out, he spoke with Joe Biden, who formally asked him for his endorsement. He then spoke with Barack Obama, again after he dropped out. Here are the details of their conversation.
You have to know who you are in politics, Obama had counseled then. A campaign can have a distorting effect on your compass. The media will fashion one version of you. Your rivals will have another. Even your supporters and aides will have ideas about who you are that differ from your own true north. Know yourself, Pete thought. Obama played to Pete's ambition to press for a Biden endorsement. Look, Pete, you will never have more clout than you do right now, Obama said. Buttigieg understood. If he waited until after Super Tuesday, with 14 states and American Samoa on the calendar, his endorsement wouldn't mean as much. Worse yet, if Sanders or Bloomberg won the nomination, Buttigieg might shoulder blame for continuing a quixotic campaign at the expense of the Democratic Party.
While he may have heavily implied it, Obama never explicitly told Pete to endorse Biden. He simply pointed out the reality of Pete's position and what would be the best use of his political capital. What about Amy Klobuchar? Previously, we had only known that her press secretary said she never spoke with Obama. According to Lucky, she had spent all the days after South Carolina deliberately avoiding Obama's phone calls, which he was trying to make. Ultimately, Klobuchar decided to drop out because she knew her candidacy had no future.
A version of the same conversation Buttigieg was having with his top aides was going on in her camp. She simply didn't have a clear path to the nomination. Or even really a murky one. Like Pete, she could hang on through a rough Super Tuesday. She thought she could win her own home state, but little else, and hoped to be the last establishment candidate standing at the end. But at what cost to the party and to her own reputation? And at what cost to Biden, who was ahead of her in delegates? She had always looked at herself as an alternative if Biden flamed out. Now he was on fire.
Like Mayor Pete, she had failed to get any support from voters of color. The best she had done up to that point was a third-place finish in New Hampshire. She barely did any better than Tulsi Gabbard in South Carolina. For her, the impetus to endorse Biden was obvious. She had seen him as the best candidate, aside from her, of course, and she thought she had a realistic shot of getting the VP slot, which at the time she did. As far as the timing of her endorsement went, she didn't really have a choice. She was registered to vote in Minnesota, which was a Super Tuesday state, and since she was no longer in the race, she would inevitably be asked who she cast her ballot for. She could have chosen to squander that moment. Instead, she chose to gain political capital. So too with Beto O'Rourke with the state of Texas. Now, was there some coordination behind the scenes? I suppose you could say that. After South Carolina, Greg Schultz, a Biden campaign staffer, started calling donors of competing candidates, lobbying them to jump ship and help convince their candidate to drop out. The book does not detail whether this effort was successful or not. According to Parnes and Allen, Obama's calculation did change after South Carolina. He decided that he would start rallying support behind Biden in the same way he had attempted to do so for Elizabeth Warren earlier. But again, he never told anyone to drop out, and he never explicitly told anyone to endorse. That said, given the other details in the book, it's clear that Klobuchar and Buttigieg would have realized that this was the best use of their political capital all the same, completely irrespective of what Barack Obama did. Furthermore, as Parnes and Allen make clear, it was the voters who did the heavy lifting.
Across the country, as media outlets reported on the force of the South Carolina victory and high-profile endorsements coming his way, support for Biden exploded. That was as much about Sanders as it was about Biden. At that moment, Bernie was going to be our nominee from a delegate perspective, said one top strategist for another campaign. We were like, this is going to happen. California, first nail in the coffin. But Democratic voters were paying close attention to the race. and they began to line up to stop Sanders at a speed that no one in politics could remember.
Late breakers went for Biden in droves, including white working-class men, a constituency Hillary Clinton failed to gain favor with in 2016. On Super Tuesday, Biden mopped the floor with Sanders and Bloomberg. Inside the Sanders campaign, they basically knew that their goose was cooked after Super Tuesday.
But for many of his top advisors, Super Tuesday immediately marked the beginning of the end. It starts creeping in after Super Tuesday, one of them said. It's not over, but you've taken a pretty big bullet to the upper chest. Biden had won in states where Sanders spent months building infrastructure, and Biden didn't have any organization on the ground. He didn't have anything in Massachusetts, nothing in Minnesota, nothing here, nothing there, said one outside advisor to the campaign. He wasn't really ready for Super Tuesday. If we can't compete against him and he didn't really campaign, one top Sanders advisor thought, this thing is going to be a downward trajectory.
Now, I want to come back to something that Crystal said in her monologue.
They even have establishment Democrats actually admitting that they may prefer to lose to Trump than have Bernie in the White House. Just take that in. The same people who described Trump as literal Hitler were okay with him winning again if it meant preventing the horrors of, oh my God, everyone would have health care.
Yes, the book does say that. And yes, if the Democratic insiders who express this view really do believe that, then they're ridiculous. However, what Parnes and Allen wrote after that is something that Sanders supporters will almost certainly find unwelcome.
Many unnerved Democratic establishment centrists weren't sure what they would do if it came down to Trump and Sanders in a general election. Founded or not, their fears of losing their party to socialism competed with their fears of Trump winning a second term. But even with all the if-then factors lining up in Sanders' favor, there was a basic countervailing truth that escaped many of the fearful establishment Democrats. It wasn't just the party elites who didn't want Sanders. Most of the party's voters didn't want him either. That made the probability that he would win the nomination as small as a mouse's molars.
I think they're right, and my evidence is that most Democratic primary voters voted for somebody other than Bernie Sanders. And as absurd as those Democratic Party insiders may have been, nothing could be more absurd than a progressive who thinks that a couple of endorsements cost Bernie the nomination. Imagine thinking that there are these primary voters out there who are saying, you know, I really like Bernie Sanders and all of his policies. I want Medicare for all, and a Green New Deal, and a living wage, and to get out of the wars. But hey, Mayor Pete endorsed Biden, so I think I'm going to go with him. Unfortunately for Bernie, the voters are the ones who ultimately decide. It doesn't matter what maneuvers Barack Obama does or doesn't do. At the end of the day, he only gets one vote. Finally, let's go back to this thing with Bill Clinton.
There was Bill Clinton telling DNC Chair Tom Perez that the one thing that mattered over the next few years was, quote, this is not going to be the party of Bernie.
Here is the full context of that line.
Sanders and Warren represented a 1-2 punch for a progressive wing of the party that had become far more politically sophisticated in response to both the rise of the Tea Party and what they viewed as Obama's timidity in office. Even in the House of Representatives, where Democrats had won control with moderates defeating Republicans in swing districts, the freshest voice of the freshman class belonged to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Sanders acolyte who had won her seat in an ultra-liberal Queens and Bronx district by beating Clinton pal Joe Crowley in a Democratic primary. This is what the Clintons had warned DNC Chairman Tom Perez about in early 2017, after he'd narrowly won his job over the more progressive candidate Keith Ellison. Unimpressed with Perez's presentation on how he planned to restructure the party and raise $100 million, Bill told the new DNC chairman the one thing that mattered over the course of the next few years. This is not going to be the party of Bernie, Bill said. But Perez was too weak to rebuff the organized and energized progressives. If he couldn't beat Sanders, he could join him for a little while.
Something that a lot of people don't know is that our political parties are more democratized than they've ever been. They used to be institutionally stronger than they once were. They used to decide their nominees not through primaries or even caucuses, but at conventions. The smoke-filled backroom deal was a thing at one point in time. Not anymore, though. Political parties now serve at the whims of voters more than they ever have. How this changed, the implications of that, and how this relates to Bernie Sanders will be the next video in this series. Take care for now.